This is our last class on Isaac, and as such, I think it'll be a bit of a catch-up class too. There's a couple of other things I'd like to talk about, because next week, our next class is your test on your 6 weeks test on this stuff that we've taken since Christmas. 6 weeks have passed already. Today's the first. So the test would be on the, I don't know, what is that? The calendar's covered over, I think it's the 5th or the 6th. Yeah. When did we which? First week of January. All right, today we're looking at Isaac's life from a different perspective. We've looked at his general reputation. We've looked at him as a picture of Christ. And today I'd like to look at his life as it pictures the daily walk of the believer. Each of these patriarchs have something to tell us about certain principles that should govern and do govern our lives. Particularly focusing on chapters 26 and 27, which became the central which are the two central passages on Isaac's life. Chapter 25, verse 5. And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, but unto the sons of the concubines whom Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward into the east country. And so Isaac was specially blessed with all that Abraham had. And this kind of goes along with verse 11. It came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt by the well Lahai-Roi. And just to start out with, I'd like to make a parallel here, which is, I think, an obvious parallel. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3 says that reads this way: Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places in Christ. God has particularly blessed us, just as he specially blessed Isaac. And yet, special blessing doesn't necessarily mean a life of ease and a life without trial and testing. Nor does it guarantee success during his life, because, as always, it takes human obedience and cooperation with the Spirit of God. Now, Isaac during his life bore fruit, and he bore two kinds of fruit, as is very obvious in this story. I believe that there's nothing unhistorical about this, but it's very obvious that the two sons of Isaac and Rebekah represent or picture the flesh versus the spirit. And his fruit, therefore, was of two kinds. It reminds me of the words of Jesus in John chapter 3, verses, I believe it's 7 or 8 or 6 or 7. Maybe I should read it. Verse 6, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, that which is born of the spirit is spirit. That's a fundamental thing, a fundamental principle. See it all the way through the scriptures. That was John 3:6. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, that which is born of the spirit is spirit. My 6 children are going to be fleshly in nature because they were begotten of the flesh. There is a normal side to the flesh. There is an anti-God side to the flesh. And therefore they're going to partake of a sin nature because they were begotten of the flesh. And only by the special intervention of God are my children going to be born of the Spirit. See? And so that which is of the flesh. And another New Testament verse that comes to mind on that is Galatians chapter 6. You have 2 kinds of fruit in life, and they produce different things. It says in Galatians 6:8, "He that sows to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that sows to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." There's only one result of flesh. There's only one result of spirit. My children are physically going to die because they're flesh. They turn into corruption. I can expect that. And that which I sow in their lives to the Spirit will reap spiritual results in their lives. So if we go back to Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 23, these are the generations of Isaac, Abram's son. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac was 40 when he took Rebekah as his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, that's Abram's brother, the Syrian of Padan Aram. Not his brother, his first cousin, isn't it? The sister to Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated by him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it be so, why am I thus?" And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 manner of people shall be born of thee, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Now, just in those verses, there's no indication of which of the 2 sons is the fleshly one and which is the spiritual one, but in the ensuing paragraph, starting in verse 24, and going to the end of the chapter, you know the story as well as I do, that Esau was a man of the field. He was the firstborn. He was a skillful hunter. Jacob was a quiet man. Jacob had an intense desire to have the blessing that belonged only to the firstborn, his brother. And the firstborn had no interest in the birthright and the blessings, and despised it. And as such, Esau then represents, he has the attitudes and the loves, see? He despises his birthright, the specific blessing of God, and he loves the world. Whereas Jacob, he has a different temperament and different values. And so these are the things that distinguish fleshly versus spirit. And these are Isaac's sons. Isaac bore 2 kinds of fruit. Now I'd like to point out right at this point that it's not Isaac's fault here. This was something that was determined by the sovereignty of God. There will be some things in my life that I do. I believe everything in my life is determined by the sovereignty of God. Some of it God knew and foreordained that it would be spiritual in nature. And then he knew and foreordained that at times I was going to be rebelling against his spirit and it was going to produce fleshliness. And so nothing happens outside of the sovereignty of God. It is God that wills in you, Paul says in Philippians 2, it is God that works in you both to will and to do. That is to have the desire and then to execute the desire of his good pleasure. That's Philippians 2:13. So that was the fruit of Isaac was determined by the sovereignty of God. For example, the ultimate fleshliness of Esau is described in chapter 26, verse 35. It says that when Esau grew up and became old, or older, it says that he married wives of the Hittites. And they were a grief of mind to Isaac and to Rebekah. Right? Some fruit is going to cause grief of mind. But if you were to compare Jacob, of course, I don't think Isaac was around when Jacob was passing on the blessings on his deathbed in Genesis chapter 49. But boy, the fruit that Jacob passed on to his 12 sons was very, 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 very different than the fruit that Isaac saw in his firstborn son Esau. It should be noted as well that Jacob acted in the flesh, and even though he was the one through whom God was going to take the spiritual blessings and further the covenant, even Jacob acted in a fleshly way. And because Isaac's wife Rebekah basically caused her son to sin, and then had to send him away for his own life, for his safety, he reaped corruption in his life. Jacob also reaped corruption. It's kind of interesting how that even fleshly people have a spiritual nature. Unsaved people have a spiritual nature. It's just stepped upon and pressed down and blinded. And at the same time, spiritual people, that is believers, they have a fleshly nature, So that is a picture of Isaac's fruit. In verse 28 of this chapter, it says, Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. What do you think that tells you about Isaac? Anybody? Perhaps. It's hard to say what you could draw from that. It may have just been that he identified, the personality of Esau was more kin to the personality of Isaac than the personality of his son Jacob was. I don't know. But it may demonstrate for us that Isaac did have a greater love for that which was like the natural world than the spiritual. Although he continues to be a very spiritual person, and he passed on Hebrews chapter 11 mentions Isaac as a man of faith. In chapter 26, verses 1 to 5, we have an episode later in Isaac's life that is somewhat instructful. There was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. And the Lord appeared unto him and said, Do not go down into Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and will bless thee, for unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swore unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all of those countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge and my commandments, my statutes, and my law. And so we have a period of testing in Isaac's life. And once again, it should be stated that just because we are sons and daughters of the living God and we have a covenant relationship with Him does not mean that we will not experience the famines of life. The famines of life are determined sovereignly by God. They are there. They're intended to develop our character and to cast us in faith upon him. And this famine caused Isaac to go to Gerar, to Abimelech. I'm not sure, but I think the name Abimelech is something like Pharaoh. It's a generic title. Right? Avimelech is the my father is king. Avi is my father, and Melech is king. My father is king, or king of my father. And so this seems to be a title of the Philistine kings. Right? So this isn't necessarily the same Abimelech that Abraham knew. He was called Abimelech too when he was in Gerar. Right? Could have been. I mean, this is many years later. Right? And so Isaac was instructed by God, he was cared for by God, and he was given and renewed covenant spiritual promises by God. I think what the importance of this particular section in 26 is this, that as I've mentioned, Isaac's experience shows us that believers are going to, by a sovereign hand of God, going to experience difficult times, but God always gives us direction in them. It was while the famine was going that the Lord appeared to him and said, look, it's okay to stay where you are, but, and then he prohibits him from going too far. He says, I don't want you to go down into Egypt. Why don't you think God wanted him to go down into Egypt? I believe so. Remember back in chapter 24 when Abraham's servant was looking for a wife for Isaac? What did he do? He went to Padan Aram up in Syria. He sat down by the well, and what did he do? He prayed, asked God to bring someone. Right? He was fishing for a wife by the well, not in the well. All right? And so verse 16 it says, the damsel was very fair to look upon, and she was a virgin. Well, from the very beginning, we're told that Rebecca was a beautiful woman. So we come to chapter 26, and I think that's probably why God said, don't go down to Egypt, because they like beautiful women down there, as if they don't everywhere. But the point is that Abraham had a beautiful wife. He went down into Egypt, and he caved into the pressure and under pressure, he lied and lost his testimony. Well, if we read the ensuing verses, they'll tell us what happened. Isaac dwelt in Gerar. He did what God said. The men of the place asked him of his wife, and he said, she is my sister. He didn't even go to Egypt, for he feared to say, she is my wife, lest, said he, the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. And it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, saw out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing Rebekah his wife. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, of a surety she is your wife, and how saidst thou, she is my sister? And you read through this, and verse 11, Abimelech charged all his people, saying, he that touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Verse 12, Isaac sowed in that land and received in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. That really makes sense. Verse 13, the man became great and went forward and grew until he became very great. He had possessions of flocks and herds and great store of servants, and he was the envy of the Philistines. And finally, verse 16, Abimelech said unto Isaac, go from us, for you are much mightier than we. This is almost laughable in one sense. It amazes me. I think it's a really good illustration of divine grace. First God appears to Isaac and said, don't go down to Egypt. It's tough times, but I don't want you to go that far. But what we see here is that Isaac partially obeyed, but he unwisely entered into too close a relationship with these people who were Philistines. At least he prolonged his, says he had been there a long time, verse 8. And I think he probably overstayed his time down in Gerar. And he lied even worse than his father Abraham had lied, because at least Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. If you compare Genesis 12:13 with 20:12, Abraham and Sarah were half-brother and half-sister. But what was Rebekah to Isaac? Yeah. Looked at it last class. She was second cousin. She wasn't. So he was saying she's my sister. Well, only in a very remote sense of the word. Like, not only had he lied to them, but it was a lousy lie to begin with.
He wouldn't even remember his dad, did he? Because he got record.
Well, what his dad did happened while he was in the womb.
No, I know, but he had the record.
Yeah, he must have heard the story many times. Yeah. So, isn't it... I don't know if it's too much to draw this out of this, people, but it may be that you could draw from the similarity, the experience of Abraham and Isaac here, the principle that the example of the parents will often be duplicated in the lives of the children, if it's a bad example. Why do you think that is? Perhaps, maybe the good behavior, the faithful behavior hasn't been modeled. Or if it has been modeled, it's been downplayed or poo-pooed or lamented. Like, oh me, oh my, now I'm a Christian. Have you ever heard somebody give a testimony like that? They've got 45 minutes to give a testimony, and so they talk 40 minutes on all the godless experiences that they had before they were saved, and then they find it, praise God, I'm saved. Well, what's the person going to remember? And I think that we as Christian parents, and those of you who are potential parents, and those of you who will be parents by adoption, and spiritual adoption in the sense that you'll have acquaintances and children that will look up to you. But all of us that are in this adult role model situation should be very, very careful about the things that we even joke about or reflect upon or reminisce about. I've met people that about the only thing they can talk about is all the bad things they used to do when they were kids. Well, I know, I'm thinking of one guy in the church in particular that's about all he ever talked about when I ever went to visit him. What he did when he was a teenager, and the car rides and the jokes and the pranks and the trouble he used to get into and speeding tickets, and he's bragging about all this stuff. Well, now his son is doing the same thing, and he's a Christian kid, and I think this is what we have here. Abraham didn't, in some cases, he wasn't a very good role model for his son. The reputation comes down, and even though these people were men of faith, yet the flesh produces corruption. And here's an example in Isaac's life. He was greatly blessed with all his father's wealth, but he wasn't very wise sometimes. And I think he followed his father's bad example. He ruined his testimony before these people. If you look down in verses 26 and 27 of the same chapter, not only did Abimelech kick him out or ask him to leave, because I think he was probably a threat to Abimelech. Then Abimelech went to him from Gerar, and Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the chief captain of his army, And Isaac said unto them, Wherefore come ye to me, seeing you hate me, and have sent me away from you? It's a commentary. They asked him to go away because they hated him. And that's a real nice situation. Yeah. And the verses that we've read in verses 12 to 16, isn't it interesting? Isn't it an illustration of divine grace that God would bless Isaac in spite of his poor testimony? Now it may have been, I don't know for sure, but it may have been that this blessing, this physical blessing with possessions and slaves and everything, it could have been a stumbling block or something. We know in Abraham's case that when he went down to Egypt, he got slaves. Well, one of those slaves is probably Hagar. And there's always two sides. There are always two sides to everything. A Christian man can look at his reputation and his business and gloat and boast and brag and say in the back of his mind, trying to rationalize what he's doing, oh, God has really blessed me. No, maybe God is allowing you to gain physical, fleshly fruit. Lots of money and lots of possessions are evidence of fleshly fruit, right? That stuff could be in the way of your relationship with God. I think that's quite the case today. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, they that will be rich fall into many and diverse and many temptations and hurtful lusts. You work hard, God will bless you with things, but those very things sometimes, or they could be, the very stumbling blocks to your ministry. I don't know. It doesn't actually say in Isaac's case that this happened, but he certainly was blessed with all kinds of physical blessings in spite of the fact that he has a lousy spiritual testimony here in Gerar. And verses 17 to 21, it says that Isaac experienced quite a bit of conflict. These wells that he redug, he renamed them Esek and Sitnah, which mean contention and hatred. And Isaac became a real threat to these Philistines, and it bothered them. And I think that we could draw from this that Christians are always a threat to the world. That's one of the reasons they hate us today, because we are a challenge. I was watching part of the news the other night, and this woman who was supposed to be an up-and-coming Canadian writer has a Mennonite background, and she's from out west. And she said that growing up as a Mennonite, she experienced quite a bit of persecution. And one thing she said stuck out in my mind. She says, whatever you do, don't let people know that you're different, or they'll pick on you. And I've heard of incidents in southern Ontario where the Amish people and Mennonite, the people that drive those horse and buggies around, people really pick on them. There have been instances where kids and stuff have actually been killed. People throwing rocks and bricks into those buggies when they drove by in cars and stuff, just because they're different, and people hate it. It's human nature to pick on somebody that's different, especially if the person that's doing the picking is in the majority. And anyway, I don't know if that's the explanation of the psychology behind what happened here, but it's certainly true. In the New Testament, Jesus said, marvel not if the world hate you, because it hated me first. Why did it hate Christ? Well, he was perfectly spiritual and did no sin, and they hated him without a cause. Without a cause. There's no reason why they would hate him. Isaac hadn't actually done anything. He just was blessed, and they didn't like him. And unsaved people don't like you, and they don't like me, partly because they don't understand us. We're a threat to their way of life. If we're right, they're wrong, and that, they're at risk then. Several times in Isaac's life, the Lord appears to him. We've read one reappearance in the beginning of chapter 26, and now at the end of chapter 26 in verse 24, the Lord appeared unto him the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father, fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for thy servant, for my servant Abraham's sake. And he builded an altar there, and called upon the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants digged a well. Isaac was an altar builder too. And he was a man of worship and faith and fellowship. If you remember back to the chronology of Isaac's life, you'll recall that for about the last 50 years of his life he was blind. And it's just an interesting commentary. Abraham was a strong, vital man right to the end of his days, apparently. His son Isaac wasn't quite such a vigorous specimen, but he was nevertheless blessed of God. I think we should be very careful that our physical circumstances are many times, or quite often, no indication whatsoever of our spiritual relationship with God. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, God delights in using the base, foolish, and despised things of the world to confound and to bring to nothing the things that are. And God will use, Abraham was a strong specimen. Isaac was a weak specimen. Jacob, as we're going to see, was a very, very morally weak person. And yet God blessed these people and covenanted in his relationship with them. So there's Isaac. A few things to stick in your craw about Isaac. Before we leave this morning, and this is on a related note, just wanted to discuss something very briefly that occurs in Genesis chapter, a phrase that occurs in Genesis chapter 25, verses 17 and 18. Genesis 25:17. Well, first, the context of verse 17, it starts in verse 12. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son. And he lists the sons and sons of Ishmael. And these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he died and was gathered to his people. And they, his people, dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria. And he died in the presence of his brethren. You hold your finger here, and go to 1 Samuel 15:7. First Samuel 15:7, in the days of Saul. This is several hundred years later. Starting from verse 6, Saul said unto the Kenites, Go, depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the children of Egypt when they came up, children of Israel, when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites, and Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. Who are the people that eventually lived in the territory from Havilah over here to Shur, which is all this southern country south of Palestine? they were, these people originally, this area was originally settled by Ishmael's descendants, and they became known as the Amalekites. Ishmael, remember what God said to Abraham about Ishmael? He will grow up to be a wild man, and every man's hand will be against him. Ishmael was the son of the flesh, was he not? And his progeny produced the Amalekites, who were some of the fiercest of the enemies of Isaac. Isaac's progeny later on. Saul was, and those people were descended from these other tribes, So it shows us that decisions made in the flesh have sometimes very long-lasting results. I believe that phrase, which occurs twice in the Bible, from Havilah to Shur, represents, quote-unquote, the domain of the flesh. It's something for you maybe to develop a little bit.